Tonight, we're delighted to have a discussion about a really interesting and I think innovative and unique for California event that happened last year and as we'll talk about during the course of the evening, has the potential to really be a dramatic change in the way California governs itself, called What's Next California. One of our guests this evening on my far right, Professor Jim Fishkin, who is the head of the Center for Deliberative Democracy at Stanford and really the founder and intellectual engine behind what I think you'll understand by the end of the evening is a quite new way to think about how we can make representative democracy work, but in some ways it's an old way. Zabrae Valentine, who many of you have met before, who's joined us for a prior conversation. Zabrae is the executive director of the California Forward Action Fund and is the person who not only pulled this event together and actually making it happen, but also turned it into something real. And she'll talk a little bit more about that and where this is heading. So please join me in welcoming Zabrae as well.
Well, it's such a pleasure here to be with my two friends here who are creative and practical and know how to take ideas and make them real. What we've done, if it works, has never been done before in the United States, and indeed has never been done anywhere successfully for 2,400 years, because it actually harkens back to a form of democracy that was used in ancient Athens, but not since. But it works perfectly, I think, as an antidote to some of the difficulties we have with our system in California, which, as you know, we've just finished celebrating or marking the 100th anniversary of the initiative in California. And our direct democracy has sometimes served us marvelously, but often it has led to a lot of difficulties making the state more and more ungovernable. What's Next California was sponsored by 8 organizations and covered the political spectrum. There was an advisory group of some 30 people who also covered the political spectrum. And we asked the question, what are some plausible reforms that might help fix the state? And after a lot of deliberation, came up with a short list of 30. So what do we do with that list? We consulted the people. How do we consult the people? If you just did polling, you'd get a kind of a top-of-the-head impression of sound bites and headlines. The public's not well informed. Social scientists have a term for this. They call it rational ignorance. You've got one vote in millions. Why should you pay a lot of attention to these complexities? So how could we really consult the people? Well, you can have public meetings, but if you have public meetings, you'll mostly get, on an issue like that, you'll mostly get the people who've got some particular or special interest in it, or you'll get lobbyists, but you're not going to get the people. So the way to get the people, I think, is to do what I call a deliberative poll. So it's a very simple idea. It's a scientific sample of people polled before and after they deliberate, after they think about the issues under good conditions. So everything you will see are our account of what we think are good conditions. That is, carefully balanced briefing materials, which were vetted by the advisory group after exhaustive discussion about the 30 proposals we came up with about the initiative process itself, the structure of the state legislature, the state-local relations, and taxes and fiscal issues. A lot of complicated stuff. We had pros and cons for each proposal. So then we brought this scientific sample to Torrance, California. A documentary that the NewsHour team, PBS, did. It was broadcast all over the state, and Judy Woodruff moderated the discussions. And there was also a report on the NewsHour about it. So the PBS NewsHour is good because people respect it as balanced, and it's not partisan. And it's evidence-based, or they certainly try anyway to make it evidence-based. So they were our broadcast partners. So what I want to do to summarize what happened, and then I want to say a few things about the implications. To summarize what happened, I'm going to show you just the first 3 minutes of the documentary. Then I'll show a few slides about some of the results. The process itself works alternating small group discussions, a dozen or 15 people in a group, a moderated group, that really talk about the issues, and then they clarify key questions that they direct to competing panels of experts. So every question gets more than one answer, so you can see the different answers, and you learn, the participants understand that the experts disagree. They don't have to reach any consensus in the process, but what they do is at the end they fill out the same questionnaire that they filled out before, and there were dramatic changes of opinion about the results. Because we don't get the social pressure as in a jury where there's a verdict and everybody has to agree. It's individual, views, what people really think at the end of the day. And that told us which propositions the people would really grab a hold of and make their own, and for what reasons. And that has led to a serious and very important reform proposal that is going on the ballot, which we'll be discussing. So we weren't just making a television program. We were piloting a form of reform where the people would deliberate in microcosm, decide what really needed to be done, and then give everybody else in the population a chance to vote on it. And it turns out, the reason I mentioned 2,400 years ago is that in ancient Athens, the Council of 500 was chosen by lottery. What's a lottery but a random sample? What's a random sample is the basic idea of scientific random sampling. And the Council of 500 met continuously and determined the agenda for what people in the assembly would vote on, because they needed to discuss in detail was this worth voting on. So it's the same basic idea, but here the deliberative poll that met in Torrance set the agenda for what people will vote on in 2012.
A project called What's Next California, a nonpartisan effort organized by a broad coalition of civic and reform organizations. These citizens were selected after lengthy telephone surveys to represent a demographic cross-section of California's registered voters.
We got a really good microcosm. You had to be selected by random sampling, had to be a registered voter. We had another sample that was never invited that took the same questionnaire, and there were very few differences between the other sample and a kind of control group and the participants. Very few differences attitudinally. The sample was the same in political ideology, it was the same in party registration, it was the same in its attitudes, and all the key demographics. We put the whole state in one room, but in a manageable size where it could think, and each of the small groups was randomly assigned, so it was a kind of random sample as well. So the small groups were diverse. We trained moderators who were trained not to show any hint of their own personal opinion, but tried to make the discussion work, involve everybody. Those moderators would come up with key questions, what was really important to know, and those questions were agreed upon as group questions and would be directed to the competing experts who would answer from different points of view. So people felt that their voice mattered in the process. It wasn't like you have one vote in millions, you're suffering from rational ignorance. You have one voice in a small group, you have of a dozen, you're 1 out of 400, and the whole thing matters. It's going to be on television. Something may happen with the results, and due to the extraordinary efforts of Lenny and Zabrae and others, something will happen with the results. The whole thing is a test flight of deliberative democracy on the scale of California to set the agenda for the initiative. And there's so many results, I won't even begin to summarize them, except to say a review process to evaluate initiatives. That went up by 17 points. Publishing the top 5 contributors for and against each ballot measure. There were a bunch of proposals that the legislature might second guess the initiative or put a competing initiative on the ballot or in some way reconsider an initiative. There were 4 of those proposals. They all went down. Even though a lot of very thoughtful policy elites thought the legislature should be more involved in the initiative, the public didn't want any of it. The public thought the initiative was the people's process, and it was because of the failure of the legislature that they wanted the people to be able to decide. So that was a case where the policy elites really were not in touch with the public, because the more people talked about it, the less they liked that. This was really quite extraordinary. The legislature only had a 14% approval rating. They didn't think much of the legislature, but in fact, on first contact, we had the questionnaire in 3 waves. On first contact, at the point of arrival, and then at the end. And so actually at the point of first contact, that was 33%. Would you like to increase the terms of the legislature from 2 years to 4 years in the Assembly, from 4 years to 6 years in the State Senate? So that actually went from 33% to 80% by the end. That's an earthquake in public opinion. Why? People reasoned that if the legislators weren't campaigning all the time, having to raise money all the time, maybe they could do their job. 2-year budgets instead of 1-year budgets, transferring from state to local government control and financing of services provided at the local level with some standards for how they're delivered. There are 6 proposals that started high and went higher. These 6 proposals, which involve PAYGO, they're all proposals for accountability in governance and transparency. These 6 proposals have been taken by California Forward Action Fund and turned into a proposition for which the California Forward Action Fund, which Zabrae will speak about, is actually collecting signatures now to go on the ballot for 2012. These are proposals that were supported very strongly by Republicans as well as Democrats and independents, and for which the support actually started high and went higher. So we haven't picked some of there were also some fascinating things that might have been more risky. Well, these are proposals that have broad bipartisan support. They're sensible. This is an extremely well-considered pilot effort to take the deliberations of the people, put them on the ballot, and make it successful. We've done a lot of analysis because we had a whole weekend of discussion about how people think about these issues. We know why they support them, why some other things went down. Just to mention one of the proposals that went way down, there was a proposal for a part-time legislature with part-time pay, which the Los Angeles Times has been saying, based upon a poll that had it very high, that now is the time to have a part-time legislature. Remember, we had a presidential candidate who didn't do so well, Governor Perry, who wanted to take that idea national. Well, that's actually started high in polls, and as I say, the LA Times thought it was good, but it went down, way down, when people thought about what they would get with a part-time legislature with part-time pay. So just because there are poll results that are high at the beginning doesn't mean that they'll stay high. These all started high and went even higher. So we think it was an opportunity for the people to take ownership. The important thing to remember is that a very good representative microcosm of California, the sort that had never been gathered before in one place, thought about the issues. These are the things they thought were really important to reform California, and now it's a practical process where it's going to go on the ballot. Everybody else will have a chance to vote on it, and we think this is a pilot case for something that actually could be taken further and repeated.
I want to try to very quickly describe how that may be relevant to you, to voters in Half Moon Bay, to voters in California. Perhaps always, whenever we see measures on the ballot that we're asked to vote on, we recognize, we often have opinions about them. We have a point of view. We like them, we don't like them. We think that they would be good, bad, a threat, positive, good for the economy, whatever. But we recognize, probably without exception, that they were not put there as in response to a broad point of view by voters. They're always put there by a special interested individual with a pet project, by an interest group with a point of view, something that they think is important, or in some cases, such as Prop 11, which we were extremely supportive of. That was the measure in 2008 to create independent redistricting process. That measure was absolutely in the public interest, but it was put on the ballot by good government organizations. It wasn't something that rose up from the people of California. And the top 2 open primary, which is the other. I think those would be the two exceptions to the rule that we've seen recently that have absolutely been in the public interest. But even those in the past, and I think are going to be great reforms, but even those 2 measures did not come from voters saying this is something that we want to raise as an issue for the state. It's something that we think it's important for ourselves and other members in our community to weigh in on, to decide together what direction we want the state to go in. California Forward and its sister organization, the California Forward Action Fund, have been trying over the last several years to figure out a way to identify policies that can help correct the direction of the state to address the dysfunction in state governance that has widely been recognized at this point, but also to do it in a way that is highly consultative, that spends a lot of time talking to regular folks who don't normally have an opportunity to participate in the process, but have a lot to offer and to contribute to it. And so we've wanted to build that in, and then promote reforms that actually reflected the will of Californians and voters and tapped into their ideas for what meaningful solutions are likely to be. And the deliberative poll was a tremendous and very unusual opportunity to do that, as Jim described. We were able to take ideas that we had been vetting for quite a while through a lot of public consultation, dealing with state level, and these are hard issues: fiscal reform, how to if there are ways to improve the way we pass state budgets, if there are ways to monitor performance more effectively, ways to make sure that taxpayers' dollars are really being spent efficiently, that legislators and the governor, elected officials, are really being accountable to voters. Are there better ways to make those things happen? Are there more effective ways to, is it possible to bring more decision-making closer to people in their communities, move it out of Sacramento and closer to home for folks? Are there ways to do those sorts of things? And the deliberative poll was an opportunity for us to put some of those ideas in front of, like Jim said, a random sample of voters in the state, listen to them, spend a full weekend hashing through these issues, gaining a better understanding, sharing in a conversation with people who, honestly, because this is one of the fascinating benefits of having a random sample, you have tables of 25, 20?
Sometimes 15 to 20.
15 to 20, excuse me. And you have people participating in conversations with others who they would never normally be talking to, because you've got Republicans, Democrats, people from LA, people from Fresno, people up in Mendocino, young voters, older, you saw the gentleman who was clearly in his 80s, folks who don't normally cross paths, in a civil, respectful, long conversation, listening to each other. They don't have anything else to do. They're trapped in that room, like Lenny said. They're not going anywhere. And it was fascinating to see how those conversations developed and how their thinking developed. And for us to be able to get insight into a more thoughtful reaction to some of these proposals that we've been trying to vet for a long time. The result of that, we were relieved, because this was all public, and if all of our proposals could have gone down the drain, fortunately they didn't. And I think without exception, the individuals who participated in the poll responded very, very positively. Like Jim said, on all of the things that Cal Forward put up, the initial poll result was high, and they went up much higher after the deliberation. As that really reinforced our confidence in moving forward with the ballot measure that we filed in November and have started collecting signatures for, and that you will see on the 2012 ballot. It's called the Government Performance and Accountability Act. And I'm happy to go into more detail about it in a minute, but I won't right now, or you'll be afraid that I'll never stop talking. But it's a very exciting opportunity to take a really important step toward getting the state back on track, and it was hugely influenced and informed by this conversation.
Jim, you've done these things around the world, this kind of process. What was it like in California relative to China, to the European Union? What was different about this?
We've also done a whole series with the same broadcast team of McNeil Air Productions, who do the NewsHour. And one thing that was different was when they saw the briefing document that Lenny and Zabrae's steering committee supervised, the advisory group supervised, this briefing document, which is 100 pages long with 30 proposals and pros and cons. They called me up and they said, "What? Are you crazy? You're out of your mind." Or actually, more extreme words to that effect. They said, because they've never had such an extensive briefing document. And I said, look, it's going to work. It's very well organized. In each session, you know which proposals have to be discussed. You have the pros and cons laid out on one page for each proposal. The moderators want to make sure that all the proposals get discussed. There are plenty of good arguments on either side as a kind of starter kit for the discussion on each of them. I guarantee you that they will discuss these things and they will become more informed, and you'll get plenty of interesting, there will be a lot of real deliberation. And we have knowledge questions. We know they became more well-informed. There were lots of changes. My God, you saw that thing about the legislature. That was like an earthquake. So it worked very well. But what I'm saying, the first thing that was different is our agenda was the most ambitious of just about any deliberative poll we've ever done, except we did one on the future of the European Union in the Parliament building of the European Union with all 27 countries represented, a sample of all of Europe, and the complexity there was they had to speak simultaneously in 22 languages. Maybe that was about as challenging. And maybe understanding California and some of the complex issues we had here, like the state-local relations here, and some of the tax issues. These are very complex. The only thing like it is the European Union, for it to defy understanding. And in both of those cases, the people understood it. So I would say that was the key thing. The other thing that was really distinctive about this, though, was we gave very broad hints that these were ballot propositions and that these might go on the ballot. And so that we weren't just talking. I mean, I'm a big fan of talking, okay? Talking and deliberating together is really important because people normally talk to people they agree with. To have people you disagree with talking in an agreeable way, in a civil way, as Zabrae said, is very important. But it was the fact that this could really lead to action that made this special.
So Zabrae, you were there and were guiding this process along. So what was your impression of the event itself, and how did you're a student of California politics. Did it change the way you think about anything?
Jim's team normally sets out to achieve a sample size of about 300 people. We do a certain amount of political polling. And for a political poll, the smallest, so a telephone poll, the smallest sample you'd probably have is about 400. So and we were, again, as Jim says, we were planning to use the results of this in these conversations that we were having that could result in a ballot measure. So the audience for us was, political people, consultants and stuff. So we know what their thresholds are going to be for validity and sort of credibility. So we said to Jim, you have to have 300, you can't have 299. And we were all, the packet was 100 pages long. And these issues are kind of dense. So we were all a little nervous that like 5 people were going to show up. We said, it can't be, it's got to be 300. You have to have 300 because it's already a small sample as far as we're concerned. So no problem. And Jim's team, our understanding was that they normally would invite 400 people to get 300, expect about 100 people to drop off. So Jim heard this, he was very sensitive to our concerns. So they invited 425 people, 435 people to attend, just in case. We had 412 people show up. Pretty much everyone who didn't wake up that morning with the sniffles came, which was shocking and totally blew a hole in our budget, I can tell you. but it was a good problem to have. It's good to go back to foundations and say we need more money because too many people came. It was too popular. So that, I mean, right there, that was a really great sign that we had tapped into something, and that, I mean, my belief has always been that people they may be frustrated, they may be disappointed in the system, they may be cynical, but the word cynicism has energy in it, and the notion of disappointment. It means that you think something should be better. It's different than apathy, that's just you flatlined, you don't care, you've moved on to something else. And I think that's really true. I think people care about living in a democratic system, and they want it to work, and that's why they get so ticked off and disgusted when it doesn't. And everyone that was there that I talked to, and there was a real buzz in the room. It was like being at a political convention or something. I don't spend a lot of time at political conventions, so maybe I should sort of imagine it would be like, but very buzzy. And people were so thrilled to have been invited to be a part of this kind of conversation, because this also isn't the kind of thing that you normally talk to people about. But people love talking about it, and they have lots of opinions about it. So that was, it reinforced, I would say, I don't know that it didn't change my view necessarily, but I was thrilled to have what I hoped to be true reinforced so strongly. That was terrific.
Out of the 412 randomly selected people across the state of California, a fourth grade civics teacher from Cunha was there, from Half Moon Bay. Why do you think this is so important? Why is this so different from the way decisions are made today in government? And so why should we care about it? I mean, it's an interesting poll, but why should anybody who sit in this audience care about this?
If you think democracy is meaningful, that has something to do with the will of the people. So what will of the people do you want to listen to? Do you want to listen to a top-of-the-head impression of sound bites and headlines where the public has very little information, or only misleading information, or only one side of the argument? There are thousands of polls that show what the public is thinking when they're not thinking very much, or when the whole apparatus of public opinion research and the persuasion industry, the campaign industry, because we live in the permanent campaign now, is trying to dissuade or persuade or mislead or whatever. Do you want to listen to the public when it's being subjected to all of that? Or do you want to listen to the public after it has really had a chance to think and it's been effectively motivated to actually listen to the concerns of fellow citizens? Because these people were learning to listen as well as talk to each other. The information was vetted. So the advisory group that worked on it, they didn't have to agree on what should be done. They only had to agree that the information was accurate, and these were reasonable accounts of competing sides. The experts had the same role. Judy Woodruff was a great moderator to make sure to bring out the opposing points of view. But the people themselves did the hard work. And so they brought democracy to life, in my view. And so, but they're only a microcosm. But they're as representative of microcosm as the kinds of microcosms you see in polls all the time. My first collaborator in Britain, when we did the first one, said he had done thousands of random samples of the British people, but he'd never seen one. No one would ever see one because you'd never bring them together, because they might talk to each other. They might learn from each other. That's exactly the point of this enterprise. So I think, some people have low expectations for democracy. They think democracy is just about who wins the election, doesn't matter how they win it, any kind of, doesn't matter if they mislead the public, doesn't matter what they say, or if they win an election just because they're good looking or they have a character that people can relate to. But I think democracy could be meaningful, and what I've learned from all these projects around the world, we've done maybe 70 of them in 18 different countries, is that the public is very smart if you create conditions where they have a reason to pay attention and they do the hard work to do all this. And I think these results are all very smart. I agree with some, it doesn't matter what I think. I think they always had good reasons for the way they came out in this project and in all the others. So I think democracy can be meaningful. The people can deliberate. You know, our country was founded in a vision, Madison's vision, where the representatives would deliberate. They were a little distrustful as to whether the people could. But they didn't know if the people could. I think that's an empirical question. It turns out the people can. So why not give the people, when they're thinking, a chance? And I think one of the really interesting roles, and this is always a matter of discovery, and we've sort of blundered into this area where the people could set the agenda for the voting in California. Maybe, I'm not saying exclude the rest of the agenda, but add to the agenda where the people's concerns. Who knows? If this were a regular occurrence, who knows what innovations the people would support as the years go by? So that's why I think it's terribly meaningful. I mean, I believe these things should be evidence-based. People should weigh arguments, consider the reasons, short-term and long-term, and the people can do it. And notice the gap between the people's views and the policy elites. I mean, it was a perfectly reasonable idea to have the legislature second-guess the initiative, but the people didn't want it, just as an example. So you have to discover that to see which things speak to the people's values and their primary concerns. And let the people take ownership of the changes. After all, the people have to live with the policies. They have to live with the government. They pay the taxes. It's their schools. It's their, you know, they're protected by the social, they benefit from the social services. Let them, empower them so that they can think and take ownership of whatever the decisions are.
The people deliberated and are going to actually have something on the ballot in November. So give us a couple more minutes about what that actually is and what they're going to expect people to vote on.
A large part of why we don't see measures on the ballot that really come from the people. Politics in California is hard because we're a state of somewhere around 37 million people. Geographically, it's a very large state. It's hard to get to a lot of parts of the state. It's extraordinarily diverse. I mean, these are all things that you know. The cost of campaigns, whether it's for a ballot measure or a candidate, is really the cost of communicating with people. And if you live in a small state or a state that's easy to get around, you can get in your car and you can drive around and you can talk to a lot of people face to face and you can hold public meetings and so on. In California, that is just not an option. For candidate campaigns, to get a little off topic, you've got, if you're a member of the assembly, your district is around 500,000 people. If you're a member of the state senate, it's 1 million people. For a ballot measure, the statewide ballot measure, you're targeting 15 to 17 million voters. So that means that almost all your communication is you have to pay for, and it's really, really, really expensive. So that's just a characteristic of the state that we should try to do something about one of these days. In my opinion, it ties into campaign finance reform. But anyway, so that's just a basic problem. So quickly, to get a measure on the ballot, you have to get for a constitutional measure 8% of the voting turnout for the previous gubernatorial election. For the last election, in 2010, we had very high turnout, and part of that, the turnout is increasing because of increasing vote by mail. But it means that the threshold, the number of signatures that you have to collect this year, is higher than it's ever been. It's a little over 800,000, and the way the Secretary of State or the counties count signatures, they do it by random sample. So you actually have to collect this year 1.3 million signatures. You have to do it in about 5 months. That means in a state like California, you have to pay paid signature gatherers to do it. It is not possible in California to collect signatures on a voluntary basis unless you have a just extraordinarily off-the-charts emotional issue that is 1 line long. Very, very simple to understand. That all translates into, it's going to cost this year approximately $3 million just to get a measure on the ballot. That's no campaign, nothing. $3 million to be on the ballot. And then a campaign, I think that the top 2 open primary, I think they spent between $3 and $5 million on the campaign, and that's about as cheap as a campaign ever gets. And you read the stories about the ones that cost $40, $50, $60 million. With good government measures, if you have any opposition, you will fail. You won't pass. You can't have any opposition on these kinds of measures because they're kind of abstract for people. So it's very easy to convince voters to vote no. So that's just sort of background and what we're dealing with. And again, why we should really spend some time thinking about the initiative process and what kind of measures we want to see on the ballot and the cost structure and so on. With regard to our measure, very quickly, it includes a number of state-level fiscal reforms and then a very interesting measure to create more opportunities for creative, collaborative, innovative problem solving at the local level. It includes a performance-based budgeting requirement at the state level. That's sort of what it sounds like, and I could explain each one of these items. I'm not going to right now so that we can get back to the conversation. So it requires the state to start doing performance-based budgeting. So they've got to figure out, they have to say what they're going to do with the money, and then they've got to track it. They've got to establish what the metrics are, and then it also requires that they do oversight, that they have a period for oversight in the second year of every 2-year session, which you've got to have if you're collecting the data. You have to make sure that they actually look at it and do something with it and integrate it into decisions going forward. It has a pay-go requirement, which is, pay-as-you-go. It means that for new programs or tax cuts of $20 million or more, before the legislature can enact them or the governor can sign them, they have to figure out how they're going to pay for them. They can't just, keep deepening our structural deficit in the state. If they want to do something new, great, no problem, but you got to pay for it. You can create a new tax if you can get one passed, which is a high bar, but you can also reallocate money from a program that's obsolete, that's not working anymore, maybe that's not as effective, whatever it is, you've got to figure it out. And if the budget's growing, you're going to have more money to spend. But you have to know how you're going to pay for a new program. This does not apply to funding existing programming. The third major item is 2-year budgets. It changes the budget. Changes the budgeting process. Currently, we have a 12-month or annual budget cycle. And right now, when we've been in budget crisis for the last several years, you never stop hearing about the budget. And as you know, the legislature and the governor get like 15 days a year to actually think about other policy because they're constantly chasing this budget deficit. So we would institute a 2-year budget. So they set a 2-year budget at the beginning of the 2-year legislative session. In year 2, they can do a supplemental to make adjustments because things are going to change, obviously. But it institutes a longer-term planning, and then they have to build multi-year fiscal forecasts into this process in a much more public way. So again, we're trying to even out the process, even out the spikes and the dips, and create more predictability for business. For all of the people that are impacted by the state budget, all of those things, more predictability and stability. So performance-based budgeting, multi-year budgeting, pay-as-you-go, I'm missing something. And then what's the other state level? I feel, okay, and then the other.
State local.
Right, but I thought there was another state level reform, excuse me. Maybe not. I'm adding them in my head now. The final item is a program where we would create something called a community strategic action plan. And very simply, at the local level, so this is sort of within a county, if someone thinks that there is a way to solve a problem more effectively or deal with an issue collaboratively, so for example, you could be dealing with youth dropout rates from school, where it involves schools, social services, public safety, may involve mental health, may involve parks and rec. There's a lot of crossover. It's something that is a cross-cutting issue. Then the county can pull together all of the different entities within the county that are involved in this issue. They come up with what's called a community strategic action plan. They've got to develop it in a public way. And again, very simply, they've got to say what they're trying to do, by when, how, and how they're going to measure progress, how they're going to know whether they're making progress. They have to do it all in public. They've got to do a report annually to voters in the area so they know whether it's working or not. If they do this, they get relief from categorical funding requirements that currently affect all of those different agencies at the local level. So they get a lot of funding flexibility. They can move tax money around, and they can get regulatory relief as well. And they get access to a little bit of money. We would carve out 0.035% of the state sales tax, put that in a special fund, And the controller every year would allocate that to the counties that are running these community strategic action plans. So if they need to create a new data management system or something like that, they've got a little bit of money to make that transition. This process has very little, the legislature has very little role in this. It's community driven, community locally approved, and community and locally implemented. That's the final item of the proposal.
Who is your organization and who's behind it, who's funding it?
The group that I work for is called California Forward. We are funded by several major California foundations. Irvine, Hewlett, Haas Jr., the Endowment, and Packard are the foundations that fund us. And we were formed in response to a request by those foundations to try to come up with some nonpartisan reforms that could address the dysfunction of state governance, and to do it in a way that was highly consultative and that also had the ability to put something on the ballot, which is why we have the Action Fund, which is our sister organization, which is the political organization.
Would you consider going to the legislature to do this versus an initiative? And the second is, if this was implemented, how it would be paid for?
Tried doing this through the legislature for the last 3 years. And we got very close, actually, for part of the proposal for the performance-based budgeting measure, which was in a bill called, the number was 14, SB 14. It was Senator Wolk and Desaulnier, and Assemblyman Desaulnier and Huff, Senator Huff. So it was bipartisan, and that measure, we ran it through the legislature through the last session. It didn't really go anywhere. This year, it really picked up steam, and by the end of the year, we had unanimous support in both houses, no opposition, a great support list, and the governor's office scolded us because they said we had created zealots among the legislators who had authored this, and they were pushing the governor's office too hard to sign the bill. That was their complaint. So we apologize profusely for that, of course. But it was the only, and the bill had more co-sponsors than any other bill that made it to the governor's desk. It was the only bill with no opposition that he did not sign. And he turned around a month later and announced an executive order to institute performance-based budgeting, but it's an executive order, so it's not binding, right? I mean, he'll do some form of it, but so that was disappointing. But we definitely tried. The other thing is, some of the elements of this proposal are constitutional reforms, which have to be on the ballot. The legislature can put them on, but one way or another, they have to be on the ballot. So this was sort of the path of last resort. And you asked how they would be paid for after they're in place.
Well, the agencies would cover the cost of the performance contracting and
The performance-based budgeting. The Legislative Analyst's Office has estimated that there would be some startup costs to transition to a new program, but they're minimal. It's like in the tens of millions of dollars, a year for the first few years. They're going to have to update their, data management systems and so forth. But not only should it not cost money, it should save money in the long run. And this has been done on an agency basis in some cases over the years, most recently by Sunny McPeak when she was the head of business, transportation, and housing under Arnold Schwarzenegger. She has some great stories to tell of the cost savings in that agency.
Cassidy, in the session in Torrance, what was the level of civility? Were there issues around that? I mean, we've come to think of ourselves as no longer able to conduct civil conversations. I'm just wondering if you could talk to that issue.
Generally, I think the level of civility was very high. We were representative in terms of party, in terms of intensity of views, just like the other sample we were comparing it to. People really talked to each other. There was, as long as the process was, the process allowed the small groups to talk to each other. The questions in the plenary sessions were the ones that the small groups thought were important. It was very substantive. There was an evening occasion which was supposed to be entertainment, where there were open questions that were not part of the process. It was just the entertainment. And then there were some stronger feelings, and that dramatized to me, it was about race relations, with the discussion, and that dramatized to me that the process, as long as we stuck to the process, I wanted, by the way, I had suggested the entertainment should be music, but instead there was but it was an interesting lesson that the process itself is designed in such a way that people really open up to each other in small groups where there's a moderator and there's an atmosphere of mutual respect, and in the people don't just, and in the plenary where everybody's gathered together, people don't just stand up and say and shout out what's at the top of their mind. They present the questions that represent the fruit of all the hard work in the small groups of why this question is really important, and they get an answer, and it's a civil answer, and that's also moderated. So the process allowed for a civil discussion, and I should say, this didn't surprise me. We have done this with Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, and we've done this in Bulgaria and in Hungary with the Roma, the gypsies who are subject to a lot of discrimination. We've done this on a lot of issues where there's a great deal of intense feeling, and it works beautifully. So if we can do it in those contexts, we can do it in America.
It helped that everyone in these groups knew they were going to they could be heard. If they had something to say, that they would have an opportunity to express their view. And if they expect other people to be respectful toward them, they need to be respectful toward others as well. So there was some of that going on. And the other is, these folks, how many hours total were they together in the small groups? 12, 15, something like that, 12, 15, kind of in that range. By Sunday afternoon, these people had bonded. I mean, they liked their groups. I mean, they practically had like mascots and fight songs. I mean, they were ready to, I have no doubt that there are people who exchanged emails and, at least stayed in touch for a while and maybe will for a long time. So I think that opportunity to get to know each other and to enjoy finding out that you maybe have a lot more in common than you thought with someone sitting across the table. It looks much different, from you. You wouldn't have thought that really helped as well.
In one of the groups that I was in addition to the fourth grade Cunha civics teacher from Half Moon Bay, there was again, randomly selected political science professor from Berkeley, a grower from Humboldt County that grew something that was legal in California but not legal in most of the rest of the country, several Tea Party members, and a gentleman who was a tiler from the Inland Empire who said that the $200 he got to come to that event that weekend was the first paycheck he'd gotten in 2 years. And this was a group of people who sat around a table for 12 to 15 hours having really serious conversation about complicated issues facing the state. It was extraordinarily civil, and if you want to see the full McNeil-Lehrer production, it's worth looking at the video to get a sense of that. So it was fabulous. Now, having said that, in the evening where people are not moderated, you also notice that it takes work to engage people in this kind of environment. And so this is not like an automatic thing. You actually have to structure this to work.
How can it work going forward as opposed to just one time? And the initiative process is a problem, and here you're doing that all over again.
It's because you have to currently. I mean, the law requires that in order to change the Constitution, you have to take a measure to the ballot. We tried going through the legislature. And understandably, when you get elected to do something, you have an agenda. There's something that the best case scenario is someone who really goes there to change the state for the better, and they think they know how to do it. Everyone's telling them they're the right person to do it. They need to stay there to get it done. And so when they're given when they're redrawing districts, if they happen to be there on the end of a decade, of course it's in their interest to do whatever they can to reduce their reelection costs and optimize the chances of being reelected. That makes sense for that individual, but it's the wrong thing to do. So that reform has to come from the outside, and there are others like that as well. And I think some of the things that pay as you go, is sort of one of those, that type of a reform. The idea of having an alternative to the legislative process for enacting law or changing the Constitution is a bad thing. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. It's the way we do it in California. We actually are about 25 states that have initiative processes, and we have the most stringent with the highest bars, the least flexible of all of them.
The problem with the initiative at the moment is that the people don't really initiate. It's, as Zabrae said, mostly special interests who are willing to come up with the $3 million or whatever it is and the multi-millions to get something through. And the people are not, I've learned the people are very smart, but the people don't get to vote on what is really a fundamental concern to them. So we have to make the direct democracy subject to the people's agenda. So how do we do this over and over? I think, as I outlined in the blog, a series of things that would have to be carefully thought through, but they're all manageable. The great thing about the legacy of the progressives is that anything in the California Constitution can be changed by majority vote, usually. We have a Constitution that's easier to change, unlike the US, the federal Constitution, which is almost impossible to change. You have an initiative which would allow for periodically convening a scientific sample of the people, a random sample of the people, who would deliberate about possible reforms, and the winning reforms would either go on the ballot, or they would go on the ballot, let's say, with a much lower threshold of signatures, so it wasn't an impossible burden to get them on the ballot. But the people would set the agenda. Now, there are complicated questions. Where would these proposals come from? Maybe you would have a commission that would vet some possible proposals, a little bit like our advisory group. You'd have to design it so that the proposals would, be things that would pass judicial scrutiny too. There's all kinds of things that would have to be thought through. But the basic idea is that the people could be convened and they could deliberate and they could put stuff on the ballot, and then everybody else could vote on them. And that would change what I think is one of the biggest defects in the initiative process, which is the people are normally not able to set the agenda. Every once in a while, there is a public interest proposition like the redistricting or the top 2 primary that shows the public has an appetite for significant reforms. But when I first got here, the first year I was here, there were 4 Indian gaming propositions, there were 4 tobacco propositions, there were 16 propositions, and I had a hard time making head or tail of them because the best way to stop a proposition is to have a competing proposition so you confuse the public. And a lot of people make a lot of money out of this initiative process, but the public, so the people need to be empowered to set the agenda, and that could easily be done with another initiative, maybe another deliberative poll to think through some of the details as well, but some kind of careful institutional design. So I think, and if we did that, we would make California a laboratory for the innovations of the people for all the years to come. And then we would set an example for the other 23 states or whatever around the country who also have the initiative. And there's several other countries I would take this to as well. So once it happened in California. California is supposed to be the place that charts the future.
The meetings you're talking about, when did those take place?
In June, this deliberative poll, and it was broadcast on PBS, and we've been doing deliberative polling around the world now since 1994. California Forward, as Zabrae said, has been doing lots of public consultations in various places. But this was a scientific consultation where we have the data to demonstrate, and really the data to really understand how and why, what's happening, why it's representative, why the people become more informed, why they want some things, why they don't want others. And indeed, Zabrae knew a lot of the things, but we have the data to really provide evidence.
The redistricting commission that the state have they resolved that? Are we getting redistricts?
The Supreme Court just decided to uphold the commission's lines. In the interest of full disclosure, I was involved in the drafting of Prop 11, so I have a bias. Our intent throughout was, how do we make this work? How do we return power to the people? Be sure that qualified people end up on that commission. That's something that's important to all of us. But it also needs to be insulated from bias and manipulation. And that was an incredibly difficult thing to balance, and I think it worked. You know, maybe we got lucky. We'll see 10 years from now when they do it again. But I think by almost every judgment, it's considered to be a pretty major success. And I think the combination of the new districts and the top 2 open primary in this election cycle are going to be fascinating to watch, and they'll increase. You know, these things, it'll take a few cycles for people to figure out the top 2 open primary, both candidates and voters, and to see the impact of the new lines.
Federal government's reaction to seeing what you're doing here in California with deliberative polling is, if any?
In this case, well, there are no national referendums or initiatives. So this route to influence we cannot use on the national level. I will say that there's a lot of interest in the government about using this kind of thing to consult the public, and they've watched the fact that we were actually spreading it at the local level in China very successfully for local budgetary issues and choices of infrastructure projects and that sort of thing. By the way, on the redistricting, I have to say the Chinese local leader who has been doing deliberative polling, who started it, to make the budget of his town, asked me, I told him, well, you know, eventually someday you need party competition. And he said, why? It doesn't work very well in the United States, does it? And I said, well, it could work better. And he said, well, tell me, does your vote count? Well, what do you mean, does my vote count? And he said, do you live in a swing state? And I said, what? How does he know what a swing state is? Where do you live? California. He said, is that a swing state? No, no. And then he said, is your congressional district gerrymandered? And I said, oh my God, I think it is. So he said, we'll implement your deliberative democracy here in my town perfectly, but see, party competition is a problem. And I said, well, party competition could be improved, which is why I'm so glad to hear Zabrae's report about the redistricting is of fundamental importance so that people's votes will count.
Deliberative polling, if you could weigh one, what would the scale at which you imagine having this widespread?
One of the great things about statistics is you don't need a larger sample for a larger population. People are always surprised at that. So the same size sample can represent Los Angeles or can represent Half Moon Bay, Los Angeles, California, or the United States, or as I said, we did the entire European Union, which is 500 million people. Scalable in terms of being scientifically representative. And I mean, obviously, if you want to break out subgroups or the rest, you might want a larger sample. But so in that sense, you can deal with large numbers. The question is, what are the entry points for the influence of the people? So one entry point, which I'm so excited about here with the deliberative initiative and with what we've done with What's Next California, is you could set the agenda. We did a series of projects in Texas about energy choices, where every utility did a deliberative poll to decide how it was going to provide power. And what that did is, with the Public Utility Commission, and in 1996 when we started, Texas was last among the 50 states in wind power. By the time we finished in 2007, they were first, surpassing California. That is, they made a series of choices that the people were willing to pay just a little bit more on their electricity bills to subsidize wind power and also conservation. And so the Texas energy situation changed because there was a commission, so that the results were reported to. So a commission is an entry point. Instead of a commission having public hearings, which lobbyists show up to primarily, do a scientific deliberative process. That's another entry point. Another entry point would be candidate selection. I said this was started in ancient Athens. We actually got Papandreou to do candidate selection with the deliberative poll to select candidates for his party, because in addition to being prime minister until recently, he was head of one of the two major parties. There are lots of possible entry points where this could be made more influential without changing the rest of the system, but just having a thoughtful and representative way that the people's views can matter. See, the people aren't running for re-election. The people are actually willing to consider the issues. So we'd like to do something, because after the election is over, the same dysfunctional situation where about taxes and spending and entitlements and the long and the short-term issues about our budget crisis and fiscal situation, I'm talking nationally, still it's going to be there when the election's over, and what to do about it is really important.
I think this is a really exciting tool. It's not enough. It's not adequate on its own in terms of tapping public input. And one of the features about it, one of the features of it that makes it work is the same feature that is potentially problematic in a political setting, and that is the random sample. Because that's what ensures that you're really, that allows 400 people to speak for 37 million people. But at the same time, if you're talking about politics and governance, when people hear about this, they want to participate. And if you don't happen to get that call, and most people don't, obviously, you can't. The process doesn't care what you think. They've got someone who's you in that 400. And so it needs to be accompanied by other mechanisms for people who have a point of view and are motivated to and a desire to also influence and inform the process.
Is there one of your websites or something that we can go to?
There's a nextca.org website, but also if you Google, which has a lot of stuff, if you Google the Stanford website, Center for Deliberative Democracy, you'll get the McNeil-Lehrer broadcasts on the website. Also, if you email me, we'll send you the DVD of the broadcast. But you can play it from there. All the results, we did a very extensive report on everything, which is also on the website. And you can also see the stuff that we've done in lots of other countries too.
The Democratic Party loaded the witness list before the redistricting commission and impacted how the lines were drawn.
A whirlwind of conversation in the last couple of months around this question of, did the Republican Party or the Democratic Party manipulate the system by sort of having people misrepresent their background when they testified before the commission, etc. Redistricting is political. Everyone who was involved in setting up this reform was fully aware of how redistricting has always worked. And I mean, talk about wonderfully entertaining but also horrific stories of democracy gone wrong. It's the way lines are typically drawn. Everyone involved in this has been involved in politics for a while, and our eyes were wide open on this. So those people weren't going away, and their motives weren't going to change. And so the system was designed to manage that. And the commission I think, did a really good job of responding in a mature, judicious way to the concerns that were raised. They were they listened to anyone who wanted to testify at any of the hearings that they had multiple hearings all over the state. They listened to. No one was rejected or shut out of the process, and anyone who submitted written testimony, they looked at it all. But they also knew, but they also were consulting with experts as they analyzed the data, and this information all balances out. And and after a while, you can imagine, when you're talking to someone who has, who's misrepresenting themselves. I mean, these people, they kind of stick out like a sore thumb, particularly when you're going to meeting after meeting. And we had people who were at every single one of the meetings observing this. It was all public. You could watch every single hearing that the commission had. It was all online, live streamed, etc. So it was an extraordinarily uniquely transparent process. And I think the conclusion was that certainly a lot of people were trying to influence them. That was what the purpose of the meetings were, and that the proof is in the pudding. I mean, when you look at the lines that were drawn and how they matched the changing demographics of the state, that the general consensus is that they looked pretty good.
All of you to give a round of applause for Jim and Zabrae for joining us this evening. I'd like to give each of you the chance to give a lightning round of concluding remarks if you'd like.
If you're interested in being more involved, we would love to do that. We need people to help collect volunteer signatures. We're doing as much volunteer signature gathering as we can. Obviously, we need money. This is a really expensive process, so we encourage people to think about writing a check. And we also would, if you belong to organizations that might want to endorse this, that's a terrific way to support the measure as well.
After 100 years of experimenting with the initiative and the legacy of the progressives in California, we have a chance to tinker with it in order to make it live up to the original ideal of the people voting on the people's agenda to make the laws, or at least some of the laws, to make the state work based upon the wisdom of the public will. And I think that a little bit of additional institutional design would work. This, it was the pilot case, and it flew, it was the test flight, and it flew pretty well. And if you don't believe me, watch the documentary. The people speak for themselves, and the results will speak for themselves, and they were very sensible. I think even it's possible that some of the other proposals that did well will eventually make it to the ballot at a later point. Yeah. But this particular combination is, I think, very compelling, should speak to the interests of, regardless of party. It's sensible. And if it passes, then I'm hoping that there could be an institutional reform that would make it work over and over. And then who knows what the people will endorse or come up with after they carefully vet these things in the future. All kinds of good innovations. And then we'll spread it to other states and other countries, and why not? And the people will still be voting on the propositions, but if they're as sensible as this one, hopefully there won't be much opposition, and the people will see the reasons. So I think we're on the verge of what could be a really historic innovation. And I want to thank Lenny and Zabrae for, I mean, I'm just a professor, but they're people who actually get things done in the world. And that's what improving the future is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And